All right, today we are diving headfirst into one of the most chaotic, most brutal, and honestly, most world-changing periods in all of economic history. We're talking about just 30 years that took the American economy from this brilliant but super unstable machine to an absolute global superpower. So if you looked at the American economy between 1890 and 1920, on the surface, it seemed unstoppable, right? A total behemoth of steel, railways, and just boundless ambition. But, peel back that gilded layer just a little bit, and what you'd find was a system so volatile, so prone to collapse, it was pretty much a house of cards just waiting for a strong breeze. And yeah, that brings us to the big question. How on earth did this fragile, panic-prone economy not only survive its own chaos, but come out the other side as the most dominant financial and industrial force on the entire planet? It's really an incredible story of disaster breeding innovation. Okay, let's get into it.
So our story really kicks off in the 1890s. The absolute height of the Gilded Age. This was the era of the titans. We're talking Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, guys building these colossal industries. But all that glitter was hiding some really deep and dangerous cracks in the foundation.
This quote just nails the core problem. I want you to think of it like a V12 engine with no brakes and no steering wheel. You have this incredible entrepreneurial frenzy, just building massive corporations and railways at a wild pace, but with almost zero regulation. And that led to insane speculation, crushing monopolies, and entire industries that were basically one bad decision away from imploding. Now, what's really important to get from the slide is the sheer human cost of that frenzy. For millions of people, the Gilded Age was anything but golden. This era saw the rise of big business, sure, but it also saw the birth of the modern labor movement, a movement born directly from the brutal conditions you see right here. This wasn't just some economic imbalance. This was the battle line for the future of America. Right. So that tension between the glittering top and the struggling bottom, well, it couldn't last. The 1890s saw it all just explode in a series of shocks that almost shattered the entire system. This is where our roller coaster takes its first truly terrifying plunge. First, all that simmering anger from the workforce just boiled over. At the Homestead Steel Strike, workers were literally battling a private army hired by Andrew Carnegie. Then, a couple years later, the Pullman strike got so massive it paralyzed the entire nation's railway system, forcing the president to send in the U.S. Army. This was nothing short of an open war between consolidated corporate power and organized labor. And while all that was going on, the financial house of cards completely collapsed. And this just illustrates perfectly how connected and fragile everything was. Railroads had overextended themselves, investors were getting nervous, and then, get this, the failure of a single rope company was enough to trigger a full-blown stock market crash. Banks failed by the hundreds, and the nation was plunged into a depression so deep that people called it the Great Depression, until the 1930s, of course.
So the economy was stuck in what you'd call a deflationary death spiral. Money was basically disappearing. Then, out of nowhere, salvation arrives from the frozen north. The Klondike Gold Rush. It wasn't just some great adventure story, it was a critical economic event. See, with the U.S. on the gold standard, this massive new influx of gold literally allowed the government to print more money, fighting off deflation and breathing life back into the dying economy. What a lucky break.
Okay, let's move to the dawn of the 20th century. The country had survived the 1890s, yeah, but it was battered and bruised. But what came out of that wreckage was an industrial engine more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. Just look at this list. The scale here is almost hard to wrap your head around. By the turn of the century, the United States wasn't just an industrial power. It was the industrial power. In pretty much every category that mattered for building a modern world, from steel for skyscrapers to wheat for bread, America was outproducing all of its rivals. But remember that V12 engine with no brakes? Yeah, it was still running wild. In 1907, the financial system hit another wall. A failed attempt to corner the market on a copper stock triggered a bank run, which then spiraled into a full-blown panic that just vaporized 50% of the stock market's value. Gone. And here is the truly wild part of this story. There was no Federal Reserve, no government backstop, nothing. The entire U.S. financial system was saved by one man, the banker J.P. Morgan.
He literally locked the country's top bankers in his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to pool their own money to stop the collapse. It actually worked, but it was a terrifying wake-up call. The world's biggest economy couldn't just depend on one private citizen to prevent Armageddon. So, this is the crucial turning point. The repeated trauma of these panics finally convinced America that this whole unregulated frenzy thing had to be tamed. The country began, piece by piece, to build the framework of a modern and hopefully more stable economy. Technologically, the pace of change was just breathtaking. I mean, Henry Ford's moving assembly line, it wasn't just about making cars faster, it was a whole new economic philosophy. By paying his workers what was then an unheard of $5 a day, he created a new class of consumer who could actually afford to buy the products they were making. And the numbers here show that explosion. This wasn't just industrial growth, it was the birth of the American consumer economy.
And here's the crucial point. After JP Morgan had to personally save the country, the government finally acted. The disaster of 1907 led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. This was the government finally installing those much-needed brakes and a steering wheel on that V12 engine, a central bank designed to manage the money supply and act as a lender of last resort to prevent future panics.
And all this industrial and financial energy was physically reshaping the nation. The factories and the jobs they created acted like a massive magnet, pulling millions of people from the countryside and from all over the world into these urban centers. Just look at the explosive growth in these cities. This is what created the dense, dynamic, and diverse markets that would power America for the next century.
So America had spent 2 decades building and rebuilding its economic engine. And that brings us to the final dramatic event that would basically strap a supercharger onto it, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And here's the incredible irony. When war broke out in Europe, the U.S. was actually slipping into another recession. But as the European powers geared up for total war, they had to turn to the one industrial giant not yet in the fight, America. Their absolutely colossal demand for food, weapons, and supplies just lit a fire under the U.S. economy like nothing before. American factories and farms kicked into a gear nobody even thought was possible. You had a company like Baldwin Locomotive churning out thousands of engines to move troops and supplies on the Western Front, alongside millions of artillery shells. At the same time, American farmers were literally feeding the Allied armies. But this financial shift you see here, this was the most profound change of all. For its entire history, America had been a debtor nation, always borrowing money from Europe to build itself up. Well, the war flipped that script completely. America became the world's banker, with firms like JP Morgan and Co. loaning billions to Britain and France. You could feel the world's economic center of gravity shifting across the Atlantic in real time. By the end of it all, America wasn't just a participant or a profiteer. Its immense economic output had become a strategic weapon, one that was absolutely decisive in the Allied victory and gave it a dominant seat at the table to shape the entire post-war world. So, that leaves us with this final thought. After a 30-year roller coaster ride of booms, busts, strikes, and reforms, America emerged on top. Was its supremacy just an accident? Or did the very chaos of this era, the panics that forced reform, the labor battles that reshaped society, and the industrial might that won a war, did all that actually forge a new kind of economic superpower, one built to dominate the century to come?